My name is Josephine Hartwell. Everyone calls me Josie, except my father, who only ever called me the practical one. I'm 18 years old, and this is for every daughter who was told to be reasonable while her brother got called a legend in the making. 6 months ago, my mother burned my architecture portfolio in our fireplace while my father laughed about my SAT score. 1,510. He looked at the number, looked at me, and said, "Cute, but we're putting the money into Beckett's future. He's going D1. They thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. It just proved they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because by the time my mother struck that match, I had already submitted every application online, in secret, from a laptop they didn't know I'd paid for myself. They didn't know where I disappeared to every weekday that summer. They didn't know what my grandmother sealed inside an envelope she left behind before she died. And they definitely didn't know that a woman they'd met maybe 4 times in my whole life had quietly built a bridge for me, brick by brick, for years, without ever telling a soul. By Thanksgiving, there were 24 people crowded around 3 tables pushed together in my parents' dining room. Beckett wore his Travel League baseball jersey to the table like it was a tuxedo. My mother poured wine for the aunts. My father stood at the head of the table with the carving knife raised over the turkey like he was about to be knighted. And every single person in that house already knew, without anyone saying it out loud, which child mattered. Then the phone rang. My mother wiped her hands on her apron and answered it in the kitchen doorway, still smiling, already assuming it was good news about her son. I watched her face go white. "I'm sorry, you mean my daughter?" That was the exact second the story my family had been telling itself for 18 years started to come apart at the seams. Right there, over green bean casserole and a half-carved turkey, in front of everyone who had ever looked at me and decided I was the sensible one, the backup plan, the girl who'd define. If you've ever been made to feel like the furniture in your own home, stay with me. And if this hits close to something in your own life, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. But before I tell you what happened at that table, you need to understand how we got there. So let me take you back to where it actually started. Not Thanksgiving, not even that summer. It started on a Tuesday in April, at 6:52 in the evening, in a kitchen that still smelled like my mother's pot roast, with a manila envelope in my hands and absolutely no idea what was about to happen to it. April 22nd, 6:52 p.m. Littleton, Colorado, a suburb south of Denver, where every third house had a basketball hoop over the garage, and every fourth had a Colorado Buffaloes flag hanging from the porch. Ours had neither. Ours had a batting cage in the backyard that my father had installed himself the summer Beckett turned 11, because that was the summer a Travel League coach told him, offhand, in a parking lot, that Beckett had a real arm on him. That sentence rearranged our entire family. I didn't understand it then. I understood it completely by the time I was 17. I was standing in the kitchen holding a manila envelope stuffed with 2 years of work. Sketches, site plans, a hand-built scale model of a community library I designed for my AP Studio Art final, photographed from 6 angles and printed on glossy cardstock because I didn't trust myself to ship the actual model without it getting crushed. A personal statement I'd rewritten 11 times. My SAT score report, printed that afternoon at the library because our home printer had been out of ink since February, and nobody had thought to replace it because nobody in this house was applying to anything that required printer ink, except me. The paper was still slightly warm from the library printer when I walked into the kitchen. My father was at the table, laptop open, scrolling through a spreadsheet of travel ball tournament fees. My mother was at the stove. Beckett, 16, gangly, all elbows and a jaw that hadn't quite caught up to the rest of his face yet, sat across from Dad, half watching a scouting reel of some Georgia kid on his phone. "I got my SAT score back," I said. My father didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "Yeah? How bad?" It should have stung more than it did, but I'd had 17 years to get used to that particular flavor of question. 1,510, I said. He looked up then. Not because he was impressed, because the number was high enough that it required a reaction, and he hadn't decided yet what kind. "Huh," he said. That's really good, Joe." He said it the way you'd compliment a stranger's dog. Polite, distant, already turning back to the spreadsheet before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. "You know Beckett hit 410 this spring? Coach Ramsey says colleges are already circling." I stood there holding 2 years of my life in a manila envelope while my father recited my brother's batting average from memory like it was scripture. "I also finished my applications," I said. "All 8. I want to talk to you both about the deposit for the application fee waivers and about FAFSA because the deadline for Josie." My mother's voice cut in from the stove, flat and final in a way I recognized instantly. The same tone she used when Beckett left wet towels on the bathroom floor and she'd decided it wasn't worth the fight tonight. Except this was the opposite of that. This was a fight she'd apparently already decided to have. "We've talked about this. There isn't money for 2 kids to do 2 expensive things this year. You know that." "I'm not asking for 2 expensive things. I'm asking for a FAFSA form. That's free. And most of the schools I'm applying to meet full financial need if—" "Rice is $59,000 a year," my father said, not unkindly, just stating it like a fact of physics. "Cornell's worse. You think we're made of money?" "I told you, need-based aid could cover most of—" "Nez, we're not filling out those forms," he said, and now there was an edge in it. "It's not just money, Joe. It's time. It's stress. It's opening our whole financial life up to some office in New York so they can tell us what we already know, which is that we can't afford it." Meanwhile, Beckett's travel team has regionals in Phoenix in June and a showcase in Georgia in July, and both of those cost real money, money we actually have a plan for. So the plan is, Beckett gets a plan and I get, what, nothing? "You get to be smart about this," my mother said, drying her hands on a dish towel and coming to stand next to my father, the two of them lining up on the same side of an invisible table the way they always did whenever I asked for something. "You're the practical one, Josie. You always have been. You'll figure something out. Community college, then transfer, or a state school close to home. There's no shame in that. Not everybody needs Cornell." Practical. That word again. I'd been hearing it since I was 7 years old and told my 2nd grade teacher I wanted to design skyscrapers, and my mother, standing behind me at parent-teacher conferences, had laughed and said she'll probably end up doing something practical, like accounting. I was 7. She'd already decided. Practical girls don't ask for plane tickets to Ithaca for a campus tour. Practical girls don't need application fee waivers explained to them twice. Practical girls make room, quietly, permanently, for whichever sibling got called gifted first. "Fine," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I already submitted them anyway, online, 2 days ago." My mother's face did something complicated. Surprise, then something colder underneath it. "Submitted what, exactly?" "Everything. Cornell, Rice, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, University of Michigan, University of Texas, Cal Poly, and Washington University. All 8. Common App, portfolios, the works. It's done. It's already sent. There's nothing to sign, nothing to pay for right now except the FAFSA, which is free. I watched my father's jaw tighten. I watched my mother glance at the manila envelope still in my hands. "What's that then?" she said, nodding at it. "Backups, printed copies of my portfolio, in case any of the schools wanted physical materials mailed instead. I made them before I found out everything could go digital." I set the envelope on the counter like it was nothing, like it wasn't 2 years of my actual heart sitting there on the granite between the fruit bowl and the mail pile. "You can look if you want. Doesn't matter. It's already submitted either way." I walked upstairs before either of them could say anything else, because I could feel my throat starting to close up, and I was not going to let them watch me cry over a spreadsheet full of Beckett's batting average. I didn't know it yet, but that envelope on the counter was going to become the second most important object in this entire story. The first one was already waiting for me, sealed shut, sitting in my grandmother's handwriting in a drawer at my grandfather's house 4 miles away. And neither one of us had any idea yet how soon it would matter. My grandmother, Vivian Ashworth, died on a Sunday morning in late January, 11 weeks before the night I stood in that kitchen with my SAT score. She had a stroke in her drafting studio, the converted sunroom at the back of my grandparents' house, where she'd kept an actual drafting table long after everyone else in her field had switched to CAD software. Because she said her hands still remembered things her computer never would. She was 74. She'd been a licensed architect for 49 years, one of the first women in Colorado to run her own firm, back when clients used to ask to speak to the architect, after she'd already told them 3 times that she was the architect. She retired at 68, not because she wanted to, but because her hands had started shaking too much to hold a pencil steady, and she refused, on principle, to design anything she wasn't willing to sign her own name to. My grandfather, Walter, found her. He told me later that she was sitting upright at the drafting table, glasses still on, one hand resting on a half-finished elevation drawing of a building that, as far as anyone could tell, didn't correspond to any real commission. Nobody knew what it was for. Nobody ever figured it out. I have a photograph of that drawing now. I keep it in my dorm room. I still don't fully know what it means, except that I think, somehow, it was for me. At the funeral, Grandpa Walter pulled me aside during the reception, away from the rows of casserole dishes and the murmur of relatives I mostly recognized only from Christmas cards. He had a small leather satchel with him, the kind she used to carry blueprints in, and out of it he took a plain white envelope with my name written across the front in her handwriting, tight architectural block letters, the same hand she used to label every drawing she ever made. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this," he said. His voice was rough. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. But not yet. "What is it?" "I don't know the whole of it myself. She told me you'd know when it was time, and that I'd know it too when I saw it." He tucked the envelope back into the satchel instead of handing it to me, which confused me more than if he'd just kept it hidden entirely. "She was very specific, Josie. She said if I gave it to you too early, it wouldn't mean what she wanted it to mean. She said timing was the whole design." I didn't understand that sentence for months. My grandmother had spent her whole career explaining to skeptical men in suits that good architecture wasn't just about what you built. It was about when a person walked into a room and what they felt in that exact moment, in that exact light. She used to say a building could be technically perfect and still fail completely if you experienced it in the wrong order. I think now She designed the end of this story the same way she designed everything else. On purpose. With the light exactly where she wanted it. She was the only adult in my life who ever asked me what I wanted to build, rather than what I wanted to be. Not what job, not what major, what I wanted to build. Like the question itself assumed I would build something, that it was simply a matter of which thing. I was 8 the first time she took me to her old firm's building downtown. A mid-century block she'd designed the renovation for in 1987, and she stood me in the lobby and told me to look up. Notice how the light moves across the ceiling differently at 10 in the morning than it does at 2 in the afternoon, she said. I designed that, not by accident, on purpose. That's the whole job, Josie, deciding on purpose how light falls on people who will never know your name. I thought about that lobby a lot in the months after she died. I thought about it especially hard the night my mother stood over the fireplace with a box of long-reach matches in her hand, 3 weeks after that argument in the kitchen, and decided, on purpose, exactly how something was going to burn. May 13th, a Tuesday, 8:15 in the evening. I want to tell this part exactly the way it happened, because for a long time afterward I tried to convince myself I was exaggerating it in my memory, making it more dramatic than it really was. I've since confirmed with Beckett, who was in the room, that I wasn't. If anything, I remember it smaller than it actually was. It started with a highlight reel. Beckett had just gotten back his junior year travel ball footage, professionally edited by a service my parents paid $1,100 for, set to music with his name and jersey number flashing across the screen in bold yellow letters. Beckett Hartwell, number 7, utility/RHP, 91 miles per hour fastball. He wasn't throwing 91. He'd hit 84 once on a good day, with the wind behind him, and everyone in that living room knew it, including him. But the video said 91, because the recruiting service rounded up for presentation. And my father had watched that reel 4 times that week already, each time louder than the last, each time inviting a different relative over to watch it with him like it was the Super Bowl. That night it was Uncle Rich, my mother's brother, over for dinner. My father queued up the video on the TV. Beckett sat on the arm of the couch, trying to look humble and failing, grinning every time the highlight music swelled. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, going back through my portfolio one more time before the last of my applications closed that Friday. Cross-checking file formats, making sure every PDF had uploaded cleanly. My mother came in to get more wine glasses and saw the manila envelope still sitting on the counter where I'd left it 3 weeks earlier, untouched, because apparently neither of my parents had thought about it once since the night I set it down. "What's this doing here still?" she said, more to herself than to me. "I told you, backups. I don't need them anymore. Everything's digital. You can toss it if it's in the way." I said that. I want to be very clear that I said that. I told her to throw it away because in my head, throw away meant the recycling bin or the trash, the same unceremonious end every other piece of junk mail in that house got. I did not know she was going to walk it into the living room. I did not know my father was going to look up from Beckett's highlight reel, see the envelope in her hand, and say, with a laugh that still echoes in my chest when I let myself think about it, "Oh, is that the college stuff? Might as well make it official." I did not know there was a fire already going in the fireplace because it had gotten cold that week. One of those late Colorado snaps in May that nobody expects, and my father had lit it earlier that evening for atmosphere while Uncle Rich was over. I looked up from my laptop because the room had gone quiet in a strange way. That specific quiet where several people are watching something and nobody's saying anything. My mother was crouched in front of the fireplace. She had the manila envelope open. She was feeding pages into the fire, one at a time. The photographs of my library model, curling at the edges, the ink browning and then blackening and then gone. My personal statement drafts, the printed SAT report I'd been so proud of walking downstairs with 3 weeks earlier. Mom? I was standing now. I don't remember standing up. Mom, what are you doing? You said to throw it away. She didn't turn around. The fire threw orange light across her face, across Beckett's frozen expression on the paused TV screen behind her. I'm throwing it away. That's not what I meant. You don't burn things, you recycle them, It's just paper, Josie. My father, still on the couch, still holding the remote, said it like he was settling an argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes. It's not like it's the real thing. You said yourself it's all digital now. What's the difference? I stood in that living room and watched the last page go in, the cover sheet of my library design, the one with my name typed in the corner, Josephine R. Hartwell, design proposal. And I watched the corner catch and curl and turn to a small orange ember that floated up the chimney flue and disappeared. Uncle Rich cleared his throat and said something about needing to head out soon. Beckett hadn't moved from the arm of the couch. When I looked at him, just for a second, he looked away first. I recognized that look. I would come to recognize it a lot better over the following months. It was the look of someone who knows something is wrong and has decided that saying so out loud is more dangerous than staying quiet. You didn't need it, my mother said, standing up, brushing ash off her knees, matter of fact, already moving toward the kitchen to get those wine glasses she'd originally come in for. You said it yourself. It's already submitted. This was just clutter. I want to tell you I said something powerful in that moment. Some perfect, cutting sentence that shut the whole room down. I didn't. I stood there with my mouth slightly open, watching smoke curl toward the flue, and I said, very quietly, "Okay." And I went upstairs, and I sat on my bed, and I did not cry. Because I had already decided weeks earlier, without fully admitting it to myself, that I was not going to give this family the satisfaction of watching me fall apart over something they didn't think mattered in the first place. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single living soul except a woman I'd met exactly once, 3 weeks earlier, in the lobby of a downtown office building, was that the version of my portfolio sitting in that fireplace was already obsolete. I had a better one, a stronger one. Sitting on a laptop upstairs, backed up in 2 places, about to become the centerpiece of something my family wouldn't find out about for another 6 months. They could burn paper. It turned out that was the one thing they were actually good at. Here's the part I hadn't told them. 3 weeks before the fire, on April 30th, I'd gone downtown after school to the Denver Public Library to work on my portfolio in a quiet corner, away from the sound of Beckett's batting cage in the backyard, which was audible from literally every room in our house. I packed up around 6:30, and on my way to the bus stop, I cut through the lobby of the Ashworth Coal Building, my grandmother's old firm, still operating under a version of her name even though she'd sold her stake years before I was born. Run now by a woman named Priya Deshmukh, who I only vaguely knew as someone Grandma used to work with. I wasn't planning on stopping, but there was a flyer taped inside the glass of the lobby door. Summer Design Fellowship, paid, high school juniors and seniors, application deadline, May 1st. The deadline was the next day. I stood in that lobby, the same lobby where my grandmother had once told me to look up and notice the light, and I called Grandpa Walter, and I asked him if he thought it would be strange for me to apply somewhere Grandma used to work. He was quiet for a second, Then he said, "Josie, I think you should apply everywhere that door is open and worry about whose name used to be on it later." I applied that night. I didn't tell my parents, not because I was trying to be sneaky about it exactly, at least not at first, but because some small, tired part of me had already learned that telling them about things I cared about only ever got them held up to the light and measured against Beckett's batting average, and I was so tired of losing that comparison before I'd even finished the sentence. I got the email on May 9th, 4 days before the fire. Selected as one of 6 fellows out of 211 applicants. Paid $18 an hour, 25 hours a week, June through August, working directly under senior architects on real client projects, culminating in each fellow presenting an original design concept to the full firm in the final week. I sat on my bed and read that email 4 times. Then I texted Grandpa Walter one word: in. He called me within 30 seconds. "She would be unbearable right now," he said, laughing, and then his voice caught a little. "She would be so unbearable, Josie." I asked him if I should tell my parents. There was a long pause. "That's your call to make," he said finally. "But for what it's worth, and I loved your mother since she was 5 days old, so understand I say this with love. Your grandmother spent 40 years being told by men in suits that her work wasn't worth taking seriously until she'd already built the proof they couldn't argue with. She used to say the trick was to let the building speak first and yourself second. Maybe you let the building speak first, kid. See what happens." So I did. I told my parents I had a summer job doing office work downtown for a family friend of Grandpa's, which was, if you squint, not exactly a lie. I never used the word architecture. Nobody asked me to clarify. That, more than anything else, is the detail I keep coming back to, months later. It would have taken one follow-up question, just one. What kind of office work? Which firm? Doing what exactly? Nobody asked, not once, all summer. My mother nodded and went back to laminating Beckett's tournament schedule for the refrigerator. My father said, "Good, stay busy," and turned back to the TV. I started June 2nd. I borrowed my neighbor Mrs. Okafor's ancient Buick, which she hadn't driven in 3 years since her cataract surgery, and happily loaned me all summer in exchange for mowing her lawn, and I drove myself downtown at 7:40 every weekday morning, badge clipped to my shirt, "Josephine Hartwell, Summer Design Fellow," printed under the Ashworth Coal logo. And I let a building start speaking for me, exactly the way my grandmother said it would, months before I understood what that meant. The senior architect I was assigned to was a man named Desmond Ferris, 58 years old, silver crew cut, a coffee mug on his desk that said, "World's Okayest Architect," that I later learned was a gag gift from his daughter and secretly his favorite possession in the office. He had a reputation, Priya told me on my first day, for being the hardest fellow supervisor in the firm's history. He'd sent 2 previous fellows home in tears and one straight into a different career path entirely. He looked at my badge, looked at me, and said, "You're Vivian's granddaughter." I said I was. She once told me a building that doesn't consider how a person feels standing inside it is just very expensive weather protection. He said it like a warning, or maybe a dare. Don't waste my time or hers. The first project he put me on was real. A mixed-income housing redevelopment on the east side of Denver. 42 units, a client, a budget, a deadline. Actual stakes. I sat in design reviews where architects twice my age argued for 45 minutes about whether a corridor should be 6 inches wider, because 6 inches was the difference between a hallway that felt like a hallway and one that felt like a hospital. I learned Revit. I learned how load calculations actually worked instead of the simplified version we'd covered in AP Studio Art. I redrew the same stairwell detail 11 times because Desmond kept handing it back to me with one word scrawled in red pen. Why? I drove home every evening around 4:30, parked Mrs. Okafor's Buick back in her driveway, walked into my house smelling faintly of blueprint toner and the coffee that never stopped brewing in the Ashworth Coal break room. Nobody asked me a single detailed question all summer. The one time my mother asked, in passing, how the office job was going, I said, "Really good, actually." And she said, "That's nice, honey," while alphabetizing the invoices for Beckett's travel team fundraiser, and that was the entire conversation. Beckett left for a 2-week showcase camp in Georgia the same week I started at the firm. $4,300. My father mentioned it so many times that summer, I could probably still recite the exact figure in my sleep. When Beckett came back, tan and sore and quieter than usual, my parents threw a small welcome-home dinner. Grilled ribs, my mother's potato salad, the good plates. My father asked him 100 questions about velocity readings and what the college scouts had said. Beckett answered carefully, the way he'd started answering everything that summer. Technically true, generously rounded. One of the assistant coaches said I had good mechanics. He did not mention that the assistant coach had said this to 4 other kids that same afternoon, according to a text Beckett accidentally sent me instead of his friend Marcus a week later, before quickly following it with, "Ignore that, wrong person." Nobody asked about my day. Nobody asked what I'd built that week, even though by late June I had drafted my first full set of construction documents for an actual, real 3-bedroom accessory dwelling unit that a real client was going to actually build in their actual backyard, using drawings with my initials in the title block right next to Desmond's. By the 4th week, Desmond gave me my own component of the housing project, the design of the shared courtyard space, the part of the whole development he told me mattered more than any single unit, because it was the part that decided whether 42 separate families would ever actually become neighbors. I redesigned it 6 times. On the 7th, he didn't hand it back. He just nodded once and said, "Good. Now defend it to the client on Thursday." I defended it to the client on Thursday. The client, a nonprofit housing developer named Marisol Reyes, asked me how old I was. When I told her, she looked at Desmond, and Desmond said, without missing a beat, "Old enough. Don't let it distract you." That night I checked my bank account for the first time in a month. $3,150. 25 hours a week at $18 an hour, minus taxes, for 7 weeks. I sat on my bed and did the math and realized I had already earned, by late July, more than half of what my parents had spent that year on a highlight reel and a showcase camp designed to make my brother look faster than he actually was. Nobody in that house knew. And for the first time since the fire, that silence didn't feel like being erased. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like advantage. The fellowship ended the 2nd week of August with something Desmond called Fellow Friday, each of the 6 summer fellows presenting an original design concept, from scratch, to a conference room full of the firm's actual licensed architects, including Priya Deshmukh herself. I designed a community center for a stretch of vacant lots near my old middle school, a neighborhood that had been promised a rec center by the city for 6 years running, with nothing ever built. I spent 2 weeks of my own time on it, after fellowship hours, sketching in the Denver Public Library until it closed at 9, because our house was too loud with Beckett's fall workout schedule already ramping up in the garage. I stood in front of that conference room on August 8th and presented for 11 minutes. I talked about sight lines and sound buffering, and how a covered outdoor space could double as both a farmer's market and a storm shelter in the same square footage. I talked about how my grandmother used to say, "A building for a neighborhood that's been ignored has to work twice as hard to earn people's trust, because the first thing it has to fix isn't structural. It's the feeling that nobody was ever going to build them anything at all." When I finished, there was a silence I genuinely could not read. Then Priya Deshmukh stood up. "Your grandmother pitched me almost this exact idea in 1994, she said. Different lot, same bones. I told her the city wouldn't fund it. I was wrong then, too." She offered me a standing part-time position for the school year, 10 hours a week, working remotely on drawings and coming in Saturdays, which I accepted on the spot without checking with my parents, because by that point, I had genuinely stopped thinking of my parents as people whose permission this particular part of my life required. Desmond pulled me aside afterward. "I'm nominating you for the Cormac Whitfield Prize," he said. "National High School Design Competition, $50,000 scholarship, plus a mentorship placement, plus your design gets built as a pilot project somewhere in the country. Deadline's late September. I think you should submit the community center." I want to be honest about something. I cried in the Ashworth Coal parking garage that afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Okafor's Buick with the engine off. Not because I was sad, but because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had looked at something I'd made and treated it like it mattered on its own terms, without comparing it to anything Beckett had ever done in his life. School started. Senior year. My father's Facebook cover photo that month was a photo of Beckett mid-swing at a summer showcase captioned, "Big year ahead, number 7, #D1 bound." Which, for the record, Beckett never asked him to post and told me later made him want to throw up every time someone at school mentioned it to him. Beckett made varsity as a sophomore-turned-junior utility player. Not the starting shortstop everyone in my family had spent 2 years assuming he'd be. That went to a kid named Dominic Alvarez, a genuinely gifted junior who ended up committing to Arizona State that October. My father did not mention Dominic's name at family dinners. My father mentioned scouts circling a great deal, mostly to my Uncle Rich and Aunt Denise, none of whom, as far as I could tell, had actually spoken to a scout, ever, about anything. I remember one Friday night in particular, September 19th, the 4th game of the season, Littleton High versus a rival school across the county. The whole family went, including my grandfather, who came less for the baseball and more, I think, to keep an eye on how everyone was treating me, which had become something of a quiet project of his since the funeral. We sat in the aluminum bleachers, my mother with a stadium blanket, even though it was still 70 degrees out, my father in a Littleton hoodie he'd bought specifically for this purpose. Beckett started at second base that night, went 1 for 3, made a clean double play in the 5th inning that was, genuinely, a nice piece of defense, the kind of thing that on a normal night with normal parents would have been celebrated exactly as much as it deserved and not 1 ounce more. Instead, in the parking lot afterward, I overheard my father on the phone with someone from his fantasy football league. "Yeah, Beckett had a great game tonight. Scouts from a couple programs were out there, I could tell by the radar guns in the stands. Big year comin'." There were no radar guns in the stands. I had been sitting 3 rows behind my father the entire game. There was one man with a radar gun, and he was there for the opposing pitcher, a kid who'd already committed to Baylor. My father built an entire alternate season out of thin air, 1 phone call at a time, all fall, and told it convincingly enough that half our extended family genuinely believed, by Thanksgiving, that Beckett had scholarship offers pending from 3 different programs. He did not. I know now, because Beckett told me himself months later, over coffee, in a conversation I'll get to, that he hated every second of it. That he used to sit in his room after those calls with the door shut, not celebrating, just sitting there, sick to his stomach, because he knew the gap between what our father was telling people and what was actually true was getting wider every week, and he had no idea how to close it without detonating the entire family in the process. He wasn't the villain of this story. I want to say that clearly right here before we go any further. He was a 16-year-old kid drowning quietly in expectations he never once asked for. The same way I was drowning quietly in expectations nobody ever thought to have for me at all. Different water, same house. Here's something I didn't find out until much later, that I think belongs here in the timeline even though I only learned about it afterward. In early July, Beckett had been looking for a phone charger in the kitchen and picked up my backpack off a chair by mistake. The front pocket was unzipped. My Ashworth Coal badge was sitting right on top. My photo, my name, the firm's logo printed clean across the top in navy. He told me later he stood there in the kitchen for almost a full minute, just looking at it. He said he almost said something to Mom and Dad right then, not to expose me, but because he genuinely didn't understand what he was looking at yet. He thought maybe I'd gotten in some kind of trouble and this was community service, or maybe I was doing some kind of school program he didn't know about. Then he looked closer. Summer Design Fellow. And he understood exactly what it meant, because he'd been in the living room the night our mother burned my portfolio in the fireplace, and he'd never forgotten it, even though he'd never said a word about it either. He zipped the pocket back up. He put my backpack exactly where he found it, and he never told a soul. Not our parents, not his friends, not even me, for 5 more months. I didn't know how to bring it up without it turning into a whole thing, he told me later. And some sick part of me, I hate saying this, Joe, but I want to be honest. Some part of me was scared that if I said something, it would somehow become about me too. Like they'd find some way to make your win a loss for me. I know how messed up that sounds. It doesn't sound messed up. It sounds exactly like what happens to a kid raised in a house where love got treated like a finite resource with only one real recipient. He wasn't protecting himself at my expense. He just genuinely didn't know at 16 how to protect both of us at once. And he chose the version of silence that felt safest, which happened to also be the version that protected my secret a little longer, whether he meant it to or not. October 3rd, 9:14 p.m. I was at my desk finishing pre-calc homework when my phone buzzed with an email from the Cormac Whitfield Prize Committee. Subject line, Application Status Update. My hands actually shook opening it, the same way they had the night I opened my SAT score back in May. Except this time, nobody downstairs was watching football highlights, waiting to laugh at the number. Thank you for your submission to this year's Cormac Whitfield Prize. Your project, Harbor Point Community Pavilion, has advanced to the finalist round. Finalists will be notified of final decisions the week of Thanksgiving. Finalist. Out of, I would later learn, over 600 submissions nationally, down to 11 finalists. I sat on my bed and read that sentence probably 15 times. 9 days later, October 12th, a second email. This one from Cornell's admissions portal, the same portal I checked obsessively and told absolutely nobody about. Your early decision application status will be available December 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern. 2 months of waiting, just like that, dropped into my inbox on a random Sunday while my mother laminated another one of Beckett's schedules downstairs and my father argued with the TV about a referee's call in a football game that had nothing to do with anyone in our family. 2 live secrets now, both enormous, both completely unknown to a single person under our roof, except me. I started keeping a note on my phone, just a private list, dates and numbers, the kind of thing I never would have shown anyone, but that felt like proof. Evidence I could point to later if I ever needed to remind myself this was real and not something I was imagining out of sheer desperation to matter to somebody. I was building an entire second life in the dark. Brick by brick, drawing by drawing, application by application. And the strange, quiet gift of it was this: they couldn't burn what they didn't know existed. You cannot set fire to a thing you've never once thought to ask about. My Aunt Denise and Uncle Rich came over the third Sunday of October with my cousins Hallie, 15, twins Micah and Owen, 11, and baby Rosa, who spent most of dinner smashing green beans into the high chair tray with the flat of her palm, like she was personally offended by them. The table sat 10. Beckett sat at the head next to Dad, a seat that had quietly, permanently, become his over the past 2 years without anyone ever formally announcing it. I helped Mom carry out the pot roast and the rolls and set everything down while everyone found their chairs. Dad said grace. Then, the way it always did, the conversation drifted to Beckett within about 90 seconds. "How's the season looking?" Uncle Rich asked, buttering a roll. "You starting yet?" Beckett hesitated, glanced down at his plate. "Not full-time, but Coach has been." "He's being modest," my father interrupted, cutting Beckett off mid-sentence the way he always did whenever Beckett's own account of things threatened to sound less impressive than my father's preferred version. "We've had a couple schools reach out already. Nothing official yet, obviously, but the interest is real." That was, as far as I knew, and as far as Beckett confirmed to me later, entirely fabricated. Nobody had reached out. Aunt Denise's face lit up anyway. "That's wonderful! Which schools?" My father smiled the exact smile he used at his insurance office when he was upselling somebody a policy they didn't need. "Can't say yet. Don't want to jinx it. Let's just say we're feeling very good about where things stand." Aunt Denise turned to me, almost as an afterthought, the way people always did once the Beckett portion of the conversation had run its natural course, and someone remembered, politely, that there was a second child at the table. "And Josie, senior year. Any plans yet, honey?" I could feel my mother's eyes flick toward me for half a second, a warning, though I genuinely don't think she knew what she was warning me against exactly. Just some instinct that this question shouldn't be allowed to take up too much oxygen in a room built around her son. "I've applied to a few schools," I said carefully. "Architecture programs mostly." "Architecture, like your grandmother," Aunt Denise smiled, genuinely delighted. The first genuinely delighted reaction to anything about me I'd gotten from an adult relative in longer than I could remember. "Vivian would be so—" "She's applied to a few community colleges, too," my mother said, cutting in smoothly, refilling Aunt Denise's water glass as a kind of conversational sleight of hand. "Being smart about costs. We think that's the sensible route, at least to start." I had not, in fact, applied to a single community college. I let it go, because I'd learned months earlier that correcting my mother in front of extended family accomplished exactly nothing except making the rest of the meal unbearably tense. And because some small, tired, calculating part of me had already decided I would rather let her be wrong in front of everyone now than give her a single early warning shot about what was actually coming. Grandpa Walter, sitting at the far end of the table, caught my eye for just a second. He didn't say anything. He just gave the smallest nod, almost nothing. The kind of gesture you'd miss entirely if you weren't looking for it. I understood it anyway. Let it speak first, it said, same as she told you. By early November, I had started to feel the two secrets pressing against the inside of my ribs like something physically expanding. The Whitfield Prize finalists were told decisions would come the week of Thanksgiving. Cornell's portal update was locked to December 15th, and somewhere in between those two dates, I had to sit through an entire holiday season pretending none of it existed. Beckett's season had wrapped in late October with a quiet, unremarkable finish. A decent junior year, no scholarship offers, real or fabricated, though my father had, by that point, told enough people at his office and enough relatives on group texts that the family was waiting to hear from a couple programs that walking it back felt, to him, apparently, like a worse option than just letting the lie keep quietly expanding. I picked up more hours at Ashworth Coal on weekends, working on a real construction document set for the community pavilion I designed. The same design now sitting in front of a national judging panel, deciding whether to hand me $50,000 and a place to actually build the thing. Desmond started introducing me to visiting clients as my colleague instead of our fellow, which I don't think he even noticed he'd started doing. But I noticed every single time. November 14th, a Friday. Priya Deshmukh called me into her office at the end of my Saturday shift, except it was a Friday, which should have tipped me off that something unusual was happening. I got a call this morning, she said, from the Whitfield Committee. They wanted to verify some information about your mentorship supervisor before finalizing the announcement. I'm not supposed to tell you anything. She paused, and something in her face gave it away completely before she said another word. But I've known your grandmother's granddaughter for 4 months now, and I've never once seen her sandbag a design review. So I feel comfortable telling you that if I were you, I'd keep my Thanksgiving week very, very open. I didn't sleep that whole weekend. November 27th, Thanksgiving Day. My parents' house, all the leaves in the dining table extended, 3 tables pushed together and draped in a tablecloth my mother had ironed twice because the first attempt wasn't crisp enough. 24 people total, once you counted everyone. My parents, me, Beckett, both sets of grandparents, Aunt Denise and Uncle Rich and their 4 kids, my mother's cousin Paula and her husband and their 2 teenagers, my father's brother Glenn with his new girlfriend nobody had met yet, and a rotating cast of neighbors who'd been informally adopted into our Thanksgivings over the years, the way Colorado suburban families tend to do. Beckett wore his Travel League jersey to Thanksgiving dinner. I want to sit with that detail for a second, because at the time I thought it was just Beckett being Beckett, a little oblivious, comfortable in his own uniform the way some athletes are. Looking back, I think it was something closer to armor. I think some part of him understood, even if he couldn't have said it out loud, that as long as he was standing in that jersey, our father had a script to perform. And as long as our father was performing that script, nobody was going to ask either of us a harder question. My mother moved through the kitchen and dining room like a conductor, pouring wine for the aunts, checking the turkey, directing my cousins toward the folding chairs at the end of the table with the easy authority of someone who had run this exact production every November for 2 decades. My father stood at the head of the table with the electric carving knife, waiting for the room to quiet down enough for him to make a small speech, which he did every year, and which every year included at least one line about how proud he was of this family's future, delivered while looking, unmistakably, at Beckett. This year was no different. "This has been a big year," my father said, glass raised, turkey steaming in front of him. "Beckett's had a heck of a season. Big things ahead for this family. Real big things." 22 other people raised their glasses. I raised mine too, because what else do you do? And I caught Grandpa Walter's eye across the table, and something in his face told me he was thinking exactly what I was thinking, which was that my father had once again managed to toast an achievement that, strictly speaking, did not yet exist. Dinner went the way it always went. Beckett fielded a dozen questions about scholarship interest he didn't actually have. My mother told Paula's husband with total confidence that the family was waiting to hear from a couple of D1 programs, but were not supposed to say which ones yet. A sentence with no basis in reality whatsoever that had, by this point, hardened into something my parents seemed to genuinely believe themselves. Nobody asked me anything beyond, "How's senior year going, Josie?" Which I answered with, "Good, busy." 4 separate times to 4 separate relatives, and each time the conversation slid immediately back toward Beckett's future, the way water finds a drain. I was halfway through a plate of green bean casserole when the house phone rang. Not a cell phone, the actual landline mounted on the kitchen wall, the one that almost never rang anymore except for robocalls and occasionally my grandparents. My mother, closest to the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up, already smiling. Already, I could see it happen in real time on her face, assuming it was good news related to Beckett, because by November, in her mind, that had become the only kind of important phone call this family ever received. "Hartwell residence," she said, bright, easy. Then, "Oh, hi, yes, this is Renee Hartwell." A pause. The dining room had gotten quiet enough by then, in that natural lull between courses, that most of the table could hear her half of the conversation. "I'm sorry, who did you say you're calling on behalf of?" The Cormac Whitfield." Her face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but I watched it happen, watched the polite hostess expression slide sideways into confusion. "I think there's been some mix-up. My son we didn't submit anything to a design." Another pause, longer this time. I set my fork down. "I'm sorry," my mother said again, and her voice had gone quieter now, unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard it before in 18 years of being her daughter. You mean my daughter? Josephine?" The entire dining room turned to look at me at once. 22 faces mid-chew, mid-sentence, forks frozen halfway to mouths. Beckett went very still beside our father. My father set down the carving knife. I stood up slowly, because some instinct told me I needed to be standing for whatever was about to happen next. And I walked to the kitchen doorway and held out my hand for the phone. And my mother handed it to me like it had suddenly become very heavy. "This is Josephine," I said. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Carol Whitfield Reyes, program director of the Cormac Whitfield Prize, calling to inform me on the actual holiday itself, because the committee chair had personally insisted the news shouldn't wait through a long weekend, that my design, Harbor Point's Community Pavilion, had been selected as the national winner. $50,000. A guaranteed mentorship placement. Full construction funding for the pilot build, which, because I designed it for that exact vacant lot near my old middle school, was going to go up 4 blocks from the house I grew up in. I don't remember exactly what I said back to her. I remember thanking her. I remember my voice sounding strange to my own ears, thin and far away, like it belonged to someone standing in a much larger room than my parents' kitchen. I remember Carol Whitfield Reyes saying, "Your mentor, Desmond Ferris, said you'd probably react exactly like this, like you didn't quite believe it yet. Congratulations, Josephine. Truly, this is going to change some things." She had absolutely no idea how right she was, or how many people in that dining room were about to find out, all at once, exactly how much they hadn't been paying attention. I hung up the phone. I turned around. 22 people were staring at me. My mother was gripping the kitchen counter with one hand, like she needed it to stay upright. My father hadn't moved from the head of the table, carving knife still resting where he'd set it down, turkey half carved, one wing hanging at an angle that somehow felt, in that frozen moment, like the most absurd detail in the entire scene. "What," my father said finally, "was that?" "That," I said, "was the Cormac Whitfield Prize Committee. I won $50,000, a national architecture competition, out of over 600 entries." The silence that followed lasted, by my count, almost 11 full seconds. I know because I counted them, deliberately, the way you count the seconds after lightning to figure out how far away the storm actually is. "Architecture competition," Aunt Denise repeated slowly, and then, into that silence, unable to help herself, delighted despite the obvious tension crackling through the room. "Josie, that's incredible! When did you how long have you been—" "Since June," I said. "I've been working at an architecture firm downtown all summer and fall. Ashworth Cole, Grandma's old firm." My mother made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a laugh and something else entirely. "That's not— You told us you were doing office work. General office work. For a family friend." "I said I was doing office work downtown for a family friend of Grandpa's," I said, and I could hear how steady my own voice had gotten, steadier than I felt, steadier than I had any right to feel with every single person I'd ever known staring at me at once. That was true. I never said it wasn't architecture. Nobody ever asked. "But you told everyone you were applying to community college," Aunt Denise said, looking now, confused, between me and my mother. "I never said that," I said. "That was Mom." Every head at the table swiveled toward my mother. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Grandpa Walter set down his napkin very deliberately, stood up from his chair at the far end of the table and said, in a voice that carried without him raising it at all, the exact tone I imagine my grandmother used in 4 decades of construction meetings with men who didn't want to listen to her. "I believe there's a letter that's been waiting for this exact moment for 11 months. I think it's time." The dining room had gone so quiet I could hear the turkey still ticking as it cooled in its pan. Grandpa Walter walked to the front closet, where he'd apparently left his coat that afternoon with something already tucked inside the breast pocket, because he pulled out the same white envelope he'd shown me at the funeral 11 months earlier. My name written across the front in my grandmother's tight, architectural handwriting. The paper slightly softened now at the corners from having lived in various pockets and drawers for nearly a year. "Vivian wrote this the winter before she died," he said, walking back to the dining room, standing at the head of the table opposite my father, an arrangement that felt, even in the moment, like some kind of quiet, deliberate staging. "She told me not to give it to Josie until," and I'm quoting her exactly, because I wrote it down so I wouldn't get it wrong, "until the room finally sees what I already see." I didn't understand what she meant for almost a year. I think I understand it now. He handed me the envelope. My hands were not steady. I opened it at the table, in front of all 24 of us, because some instinct told me that whatever was inside belonged, at this point, to everyone in that room, whether they'd earned the right to hear it or not. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, and a folded document that turned out to be a bank statement. I read the letter out loud. I'm not going to pretend I remember every word of it perfectly, but I remember enough, and I've read it probably 200 times since that night, so I can get close. "Josie, if you're reading this, it means Walter judged the timing correctly, which, frankly, I never doubted, because he's been reading rooms for me for 51 years, and I trust his eye almost as much as I trust my own. I want to tell you something I never told your mother, because your mother and I loved each other very much and disagreed about almost everything, including, especially, what it means to keep a child safe. I spent my whole career being underestimated by people who mattered less than they thought they did. Clients, partners. Once, memorably, a building inspector who insisted on calling me young lady until the day I retired, at which point I was 68 years old. I got used to being underestimated. I never once got used to being disbelieved by my own family. And I watched that happen to you, quietly, for years, long before you were old enough to notice it happening. I started a scholarship fund at Ashworth Cole in 1998, funded by my own retirement savings, meant to support one design student a year who reminded me of myself at 17. Someone with real talent and no institutional support behind them. I never told your mother I ran it. I never told anyone in the family. It has quietly funded 11 students over 26 years. This year, I told Priya something I never told another living soul until now. I wanted the 12th recipient to be you, if you ever came looking for that door yourself, the way I always suspected you eventually would, without anyone in this family pushing you toward it. I set aside a separate trust as well, outside of the scholarship fund, in your name specifically. $78,000, invested since you were 9 years old, meant to cover whatever gap remained between what a school offered you and what your family was willing to provide. I did not tell your parents about this trust, and I want you to know that was a deliberate choice, not an oversight. I did not want this gift to become a bargaining chip, or a reason for your mother and father to feel justified in continuing to underinvest in you, believing someone else would quietly cover the difference. I wanted this money to exist only for you, released only when you'd already proven, to yourself, not to them, exactly what you were capable of building without it. I don't know what year you're reading this in, or what you've already accomplished by the time you do. I only know this. You were named after nobody in particular, which used to bother your mother, who wanted to name you after her grandmother. I insisted on Josephine because I liked how it sounded like a name a person could grow an entire career into. I think I was right. I usually am, dear, though I've learned it's more polite not to say so quite this directly while I'm alive to hear myself say it. Build something extraordinary. Sign your own name to it. Don't wait for anyone at that table to notice before you decide it's real. All my love, always, from the one person in this family who was always watching closely enough to see you, Grandma Vivian. I finished reading. Nobody at that table said a single word for a long time. My mother was crying, silently, both hands pressed over her mouth. My father was staring at the folded bank statement in my hands like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked at it hard enough. $78,000, he said finally, quietly, almost to himself. Invested since I was 9, I said, which means it's grown. Grandpa, do you know the current balance? Grandpa Walter nodded slowly. Vivian had me check it last month, actually, right before all this. It's just over $91,000 now. Aunt Denise had started crying too, and I watched something ripple around the table, a kind of collective recalculation happening in real time on 22 different faces, everyone quietly resorting the last several years of family dinners against this new information, everyone realizing, more or less simultaneously, that they'd spent 2 years enthusiastically toasting a fabricated recruiting story, while the actual extraordinary thing happening in that house had been sitting quietly at the other end of the table the entire time, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask her a real question. I want to be honest about something that doesn't often make it into stories like this one. The rest of that Thanksgiving dinner did not turn into a beautiful, tearful celebration. It turned into something much messier and much more real. My mother left the table almost immediately, disappearing into the downstairs bathroom for nearly 20 minutes, while Aunt Denise, awkwardly, tried to keep the conversation moving among the cousins. My father sat perfectly still at the head of the table for a long time, not eating, not carving the rest of the turkey, just staring at a spot somewhere past my shoulder. Beckett was the first person to actually get up and come over to me. He didn't say anything grand. He just pulled me into a hug, right there in the dining room in front of everyone, and said, quietly, into my ear, "I knew. I found your badge in July. I should have said something months ago. I'm sorry, Joe. I'm so sorry." I told him I knew he'd figure it out eventually, and that I understood why he hadn't said anything, and that none of this was ever his fault to fix. My grandmother's brother, my great-uncle Frank, who almost never spoke at these dinners, cleared his throat and said, to no one in particular, "Vivian always said this girl had her hands." Nobody asked him to elaborate. Somehow, everyone understood exactly what he meant. My father eventually stood up, walked around the table, and stopped next to my chair. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I need some air. I need to... I'm sorry, Josie. I need a minute before I can say anything that's actually worth saying." He went out to the backyard, past the batting cage, and stood there alone in the cold for almost half an hour, while the rest of us finished a strange, subdued version of Thanksgiving dinner. Dessert served quietly, most of the usual laughter and noise replaced by a kind of careful, watchful gentleness nobody quite knew how to perform correctly. I didn't get an apology that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be tempting in a story like this to wrap the whole night up in a neat bow. Tears, hugs, everyone instantly transformed. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and slower, and honestly, more believable. What happened was 22 people leaving that house that night, having watched, in real time, 18 years of quiet family mythology come apart over green bean casserole, and every single one of them having to go home and sit with that on their own. I drove to Grandpa Walter's house that night instead of staying under my parents' roof. He didn't ask if I wanted to. He just said, "Get your things, kid. Your old room's still made up." And that was that. I stayed at Grandpa Walter's for the first 10 days of December. My mother texted almost every day. Short messages, tentative, nothing like her usual brisk, organizing the household tone. "We miss you. Are you eating enough? Can we talk when you're ready?" I answered most of them, briefly, politely, the way you'd answer a coworker you respected but didn't yet trust. December 4th, a Thursday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a knock at Grandpa's door. I heard my mother's voice before I saw her, apologizing to Grandpa for showing up unannounced, asking if I was home, if I'd be willing to talk. I came downstairs. She looked exhausted in a way I hadn't seen on her before. No makeup, hair pulled back messily, eyes red like she'd been crying on and off for days rather than one dramatic burst. Grandpa gave us the living room and retreated to the kitchen, close enough to hear if things went badly, far enough to give us actual privacy. We sat across from each other on furniture that had been in that house since before I was born. Neither of us said anything for almost a full minute. "I keep trying to figure out how I missed it," she said finally. "The whole summer, the whole fall. I keep going back over it in my head. Every conversation, trying to find the moment I should have asked a real question. And I can't even find it, Josie, because I don't think I ever asked you a single real question. Not once. That's what scares me the most. It's not even that I asked and didn't listen. I never asked at all. You didn't, I agreed. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just done softening things to make them easier for other people to hear. You asked Beckett real questions constantly. Velocity, exit off the bat speed, what the coaches said, how he felt about starting. You never once asked me a follow-up question about anything. Not my classes, not my applications, not the office job. I used to think it was because you assumed I had it handled. Now I think it's because you genuinely never thought there was anything there worth asking about. She started crying again, quietly this time, not the performative kind. Something that looked more tired than dramatic. I thought I was protecting you, she said. Isn't that insane? I actually believed that. I thought if I don't get her hopes up about these huge, expensive, competitive things, she won't get crushed when it doesn't work out. I thought I was being the responsible one, the one who kept us grounded in reality. You weren't protecting me from disappointment, I said. You were protecting yourself from having to watch me try something big and maybe fail at it in front of everyone, because that would have required you to actually root for me the way you root for Beckett, out loud, in public, with no guarantee it would work. It's easier to just decide in advance that I'm the practical one who doesn't need that kind of investment. That way you never have to risk being disappointed for me. You just get to be quietly, safely, unsurprised. She didn't argue with that. She just sat there, letting it land, which was, I think, more honest than any denial would have been. I'm sorry, she said eventually. I know that's not enough. I know I have to actually be different, not just say the word, but I need you to know I mean it. I believe that you mean it right now, I said. I don't know yet if it's going to last past January. I need some time to find out. Not because I want to punish you, because I genuinely don't know yet, and I'm not going to pretend I do just to make this conversation end faster. She nodded. She stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back. For what it's worth, and I don't expect this to fix anything, I looked up Harbor Point last night, the renderings you submitted. I sat in my car in the driveway and looked at every single image on my phone for almost 40 minutes before I came inside. It's beautiful, Josie. It's genuinely, actually beautiful. I should have said that the second I heard the word "one" on Thanksgiving, instead of standing there in shock. I'm sorry it took me 11 days to say it. That one landed harder than the apology had. I didn't tell her that. I just said thank you and let her go. My father took longer. He didn't show up at Grandpa's for almost 3 weeks, which, honestly, tracked. He'd always been the parent who processed things by disappearing into logistics, into spreadsheets, into anything that let him avoid sitting still with a feeling for more than 90 seconds at a time. He came on December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, which I'd spent at Grandpa's with a small, quiet gathering that included Beckett, but not, at my request, my parents. My father knocked, and I answered, and we stood on Grandpa's porch in the cold because I wasn't ready to let him back into a house that had started, in the past month, to feel genuinely safe. I want to apologize, he said. No preamble. I think, for my father, that was itself a kind of enormous effort. Usually he led with context, with justification, with the story he'd already built in his head to make himself look reasonable before anyone had a chance to push back. Okay, I said. I was wrong. About a lot of things. About what mattered. About... He stopped, started again. About you, specifically. I spent years telling myself I was being fair, that I loved you both the same. And I think some part of me genuinely believed that, which honestly might be the worst part, because it means I wasn't even lying on purpose. I just never noticed I was doing it. You weren't fair, I said. You don't have to convince me of that. I lived it. I know. He looked older than I remembered him looking even a month earlier. Smaller somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with his actual size. Can you forgive me? Eventually, probably, I said. Not today. I need you to actually earn it. The same way I earned everything else this year, quietly, over time, with actual proof, not just a good conversation on a cold porch in December. I need you to ask me real questions and actually listen to the answers. I need you to go to a portfolio review with me sometime and ask a specific question about a specific drawing instead of just saying it's impressive and changing the subject back to Beckett's spring schedule. I need to see it, not just hear it. He nodded slowly. That's fair. I can do that. I want to do that. Then start now, I said. Ask me a real question. About Harbor Point, something specific. He was quiet for a second, genuinely thinking, which I think might have been the first time in years he'd actually paused before responding to something I'd said. The covered outdoor space, he said finally. The one that doubles as a market and a storm shelter. How does the roof structure handle both loads without making the market space feel enclosed and heavy the rest of the year? I stood there on that porch, stunned for a second, because it was, genuinely, a good, specific, real question, the kind an actual attentive person would ask. And I realized he must have actually gone and looked at my renderings closely enough to formulate it. Probably more than once. Probably alone. Probably without telling anyone. I answered him, in detail. For almost 10 minutes, standing on a cold porch in December, my father listened to an entire explanation of a cantilevered steel truss system without once looking at his phone or mentioning baseball. And when I finished, he said, "That's really smart, Josie. That's genuinely really smart." And for the first time since I could remember, it didn't feel like a compliment aimed at a stranger's dog. It felt like he meant it. That's a start, I told him. Not a finish, a start. I'll take a start, he said. I almost forgot. In the chaos of everything else that November and December had thrown at me, that there was still one piece of news left outstanding. The one I'd actually been waiting on the longest. Cornell's early decision portal was set to update at 5 p.m. Eastern, which meant 3 p.m. my time, on December 15th, a Monday. I was at Ashworth Coal that afternoon, at my own desk now. Priya had given me an actual desk in October, a small one tucked near the window in the corner of the drafting floor, with my name on a little placard that Desmond had made himself on the office label maker as a joke that had somehow become permanent. I told myself I was going to check the portal calmly, professionally, on my lunch break, like a mature person. Instead, I sat frozen at 2:58 p.m., refreshing my email over and over, heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears, while Desmond, who'd figured out exactly what was happening from the look on my face, quietly closed his own laptop and came to stand behind my chair, arms crossed, The way I imagine he'd stood behind 100 junior architects waiting on 100 different verdicts over 30 years of practice. At 3:01, the portal updated. Congratulations, Josephine. It is my great pleasure to offer you admission to Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, Class of 2030. I read it 3 times before the words actually assembled themselves into something my brain could accept as real. Then I made a sound I am fairly certain nobody in that office had ever heard me make before. Something between a laugh and a sob, and Desmond put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Vivian's granddaughter." Like that explained absolutely everything, which, honestly, at that point, it did. I called Grandpa Walter first. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been sitting by the phone all afternoon, which, it turned out, he had. "Tell me," he said, no hello. "I'm in." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. And then I heard him, unmistakably, crying. My grandfather, who I had watched deliver his own wife's eulogy without his voice breaking once, crying on the phone because his granddaughter got into college. "She would have loved this so much," he finally managed. "She would have been completely unbearable about it, Josie. Completely, insufferably proud. I need you to know that." I called my mother next. I hadn't planned to. I'd half decided I would just text her, keep some careful distance intact. But something in me wanted her to hear it in real time, wanted to give her the chance to actually be present for this, the way she'd never quite managed to be present for anything of mine before. She picked up on the second ring. "Josie, is everything okay?" "I got into Cornell," I said. "Early decision. It's official." The sound she made was not performative. I could tell, even over the phone, even with all the complicated history sitting between us. It was pure, unfiltered, physical relief and joy. The kind of sound a parent makes when something they genuinely, desperately hoped for, finally, actually happens. "Oh my God," she said. "Oh my God, Josie. I'm so proud of you. I am so, so proud of you." A pause, and then quieter. "I know I don't get to say that the way I used to say it about other things. I know I have to earn the right to say it and actually mean something by it. But I need you to know I mean it right now, completely, with everything I have." "I know," I said. And for the first time in a long time, I actually did. I want to take a minute here to tell you what happened to Beckett, because I think his part of this story matters just as much as mine, even if it's smaller, quieter, and doesn't come with a $50,000 prize attached. In late November, right around the time everything with me blew open, Beckett sat our parents down, on his own, without me there, which I only found out about afterward, and told them, calmly, that he didn't want to keep playing travel baseball into his senior year. That he liked the sport fine, that he had never, not once, actually believed he was D1 material, and that he'd spent 2 years terrified of being the one to say so out loud, because he watched what happened whenever the family narrative about him wobbled even slightly. He told them he wanted to try something else entirely. He'd developed a real interest in sports broadcasting after doing color commentary for his school's JV games as a favor to a teacher the year before, and he wanted to look at smaller programs with strong communications departments instead of chasing baseball scholarships that, in his own words, were never actually there in the first place. Not really. Not the way Dad kept telling everybody. My father, according to Beckett, went quiet for a long time after that conversation. Then he said, "Okay, tell me about broadcasting then. I don't know anything about it, but I want to. Which, from our father, in November, mid-transformation, still raw from Thanksgiving, was about as close to a perfect response as either of us could have hoped for. Beckett ended up applying to 3 smaller state schools with strong communications programs, and in February he got into his top choice, a program at a school 2 hours from Denver with a partnership that placed students directly into internships at regional sports networks. He was thrilled. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly thrilled. In a way, I don't think I'd seen him about anything baseball-related in years. We met for coffee in early January, just the two of us, at a place near his school with outdoor seating even though it was freezing, because Beckett said he wanted to talk somewhere that felt neutral. Not our parents' kitchen, not Grandpa's living room. I should have told him the truth 2 years ago, he said, wrapping both hands around his cup. About all of it. About not being D1 material. About the highlight reel being basically fake. About your badge, honestly, I think if I'd said something back in July, maybe things would have come out differently. Gentler. I don't know. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it needed to happen exactly the way it happened. All at once, in front of everyone, for it to actually stick. I don't know either. I've stopped trying to rewrite it in my head. I'm proud of you, he said. I don't think I've ever actually said that to you directly. Not once. I'm proud of you, Joe. What you built this year is genuinely incredible, and I should have said something a long time before Thanksgiving forced my hand. You're going to be good at broadcasting, I told him. You've always been better at talking about the game than actually playing it, if I'm honest. He laughed, loud enough that a couple at the next table glanced over. Yeah, that tracks. That tracks completely. We sat out there for almost 2 hours, past when our coffee had gone cold, talking about everything. His program, my portfolio, Grandma, the letter, all of it. It was the longest real conversation the two of us had had in years, maybe ever. And when we finally stood up to leave, he pulled me into a hug and said into my shoulder, I've got your back from here on out. For real this time. I believed him. I still do. I mentioned earlier that when Grandpa Walter found my grandmother in her studio, she had one hand resting on a half-finished elevation drawing that didn't seem to correspond to any actual commission. I want to come back to that now, because I didn't understand what it was until February, and when I finally did, it knocked the wind out of me in a way almost nothing else in this entire story had. After I got into Cornell, Grandpa Walter gave me a box of Grandma's old studio materials, sketchbooks, drafting tools, a set of technical pens she'd used for 50 years, and, tucked at the very bottom, the unfinished drawing itself, rolled in a protective tube she must have prepared herself at some point, because there was a small handwritten label on the tube. For Josie, when she's ready to see it. I unrolled it on Grandpa's dining table in February, the same table where the letter had been read out loud 11 weeks earlier. It was an elevation drawing, careful, precise, unmistakably her hand. A building with a distinctive covered outdoor space along one side, a specific roofline detail, a particular arrangement of windows that let light fall across a lobby floor in long diagonal bands. I stared at it for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. It was Harbor Point. Not exactly. The proportions were slightly different, the site context clearly imagined rather than measured to my actual vacant lot. But the bones of it, the fundamental idea, the covered space that could become a market or a shelter depending on the day, the long diagonal light bands across the lobby floor, all of it was unmistakably, structurally, the same building I had designed independently, alone, in the Denver Public Library months after she died, without ever having seen this drawing. I called Grandpa immediately, hands shaking, and read him the date scrawled in the corner of the drawing in her tiny architectural handwriting. October, 3 years before she died. 3 years before I was even a junior in high school. 3 years before I'd designed anything like it, before I even fully knew what I wanted to build. She used to talk about that lot, Grandpa said slowly, remembering. The one by your old middle school. She pitched almost this exact concept to the city, informally, years and years ago. They turned her down. She never fully let it go. I think, Josie, she'd been quietly circling this idea for years. And I think somewhere along the way, without either of you ever discussing it directly, it found its way into you anyway. I don't have a tidy explanation for this. I'm not going to pretend I do. Maybe it was simple proximity. Maybe I'd absorbed more of her design instincts over years of childhood visits to her studio than either of us ever realized consciously. Maybe it was coincidence, two architects with the same eye landing independently on a similar solution to a similar problem. Or maybe, and this is the version I actually believe, the version I choose to believe, because I think she would have wanted me to. Maybe some ideas really do move through a family quietly, generation to generation, waiting for the right hands to finally pick up the pencil and finish the thought. I brought the drawing with me when I moved to Ithaca in August. It hangs above my desk now, next to the framed rendering of the actual Harbor Point Pavilion, which broke ground that same June, 4 blocks from the house I grew up in, exactly where she'd apparently imagined it belonged all along, years before either of us knew we were building toward the same thing. I packed for Cornell in the second week of August. Clothes, books, my grandmother's old set of technical pens, wrapped carefully in a case that had survived 49 years of her actual practice and, apparently, was about to survive a cross-country move to start a 50th year of somebody else's. My parents asked, more than once, if they could help pack, if they could drive me to the airport, if they could come along for move-in weekend. I told them, gently, that I wanted this particular trip to be mine. Me and Grandpa Walter. The same 2 people who'd quietly built the foundation of this whole year together while nobody else was watching. My father accepted that without argument, which itself told me something about how much had actually shifted since December. "Whatever you need," he said. "I'll be here when you get back for winter break. I'll ask you real questions then, too." My mother hugged me for a long time at the door before I left for the airport, longer than she usually hugged anyone, and said, into my hair, "I'm going to keep earning it. Every single week. I mean that." Beckett drove up from his own school to say goodbye, showed up unannounced 2 days before my flight with a card that just said, in his terrible handwriting, "Go build something incredible. I'll be watching the game tape." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Grandpa Walter and I drove to the airport together on a Thursday morning in mid-August. At the security line, he pulled me into a hug that lasted a full minute, maybe longer. "You're going to do extraordinary things, kid," he said. "Thanks, Grandpa, for all of it, for keeping the letter, for the drive today, for everything, honestly. And Josie." He held me by the shoulders, looked at me the way he used to look at Grandma's finished drawings, appraising, careful, proud in a way that didn't need to be loud to be real. "Your grandmother was right about you. Quiet, sharp, built to last. You're going to do things she only ever sketched. But she'll be watching, and so will I." I hugged him again, harder, and then I walked through security without looking back, because I'd learned, finally, after 18 years, that you don't have to keep checking behind you for approval from people who are only just now learning how to give it. I moved into Baker Tower, one of the older dorms on Cornell's campus, room 314, a narrow window looking out over a slope of trees already starting to turn at the edges, even though it was only late August. My roommate, a girl named Priyanka from outside Chicago, who was also starting in the architecture program, had already covered half her side of the room in fabric swatches and paint chips before I'd even finished unpacking my first box. I hung Grandma's unfinished drawing above my desk the first night, right next to the framed photo Grandpa Walter had given me of her standing in front of the Ashworth Coal Building in 1979, hard hat under one arm, squinting into the sun, looking exactly as certain of herself as every story anyone had ever told me about her suggested she'd been, every single day of her career. The first week of studio classes hit like a wave. Professors who didn't care at all who your family was, who cared only whether your section lines were clean and your reasoning held up under questioning. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I wasn't intimidated by it the way I thought I might be. Desmond had spent a summer teaching me to defend a design in front of skeptical adults twice my age. My professors, it turned out, were nothing compared to a room full of licensed architects arguing about 6 inches of hallway width. I called my parents most Sundays, real calls, not the clipped obligatory check-ins we used to have. My father asked, every single time, at least one specific question about whatever project I was working on that week. Sometimes a good question, sometimes a clumsy one, but always, unmistakably, a real one, asked by someone who'd clearly been thinking about it in advance. My mother started sending me photos of things that reminded her of me. A building downtown with an interesting roofline, an article about a female architect she'd read about. Small, unglamorous proof, week after week, that she was paying attention now in a way she never had before. I'm not going to tell you it was instantly perfect. There were still calls that felt a little stiff, a little effortful on both sides, the two of us still learning a new language after 18 years of speaking a different one. But effortful is not the same as absent. Effortful, I was slowly learning, is what repair actually looks like. Day after ordinary day, long after the dramatic part of the story is over. Harbor Point broke ground the following June, back in Denver, 4 blocks from the house I grew up in. I flew home for it, my first trip back since winter break. My design, finally, physically, about to become a building instead of a set of drawings on a wall. The whole family came. My parents, Beckett, driving down from his own school for the weekend. Grandpa Walter, standing at the edge of the vacant lot in a suit he told me he'd specifically had tailored for the occasion because Vivian would never forgive me if I showed up looking sloppy for this. Priya Deshmukh spoke first, then Carol Whitfield Reyes from the prize committee, and then, to my complete surprise, they asked me to say a few words before the ceremonial groundbreaking itself. I stood in front of maybe 80 people, city officials, neighborhood residents who'd been waiting 6 years for something to be built on that exact lot, my entire extended family standing near the front, and I talked about how a building for a neighborhood that's been overlooked has to work twice as hard to earn people's trust, because the first thing it has to repair isn't structural. It's the feeling that nobody was ever going to build them anything at all. I looked out at my father in that crowd, listening. Actually listening. No phone in his hand, no half-formed lie about scouts in the stands. I looked at my mother, who was crying again. The good kind this time, unmistakably. Afterward, an older woman from the neighborhood association came up to me, gripped both my hands in hers, and said, "My grandkids are going to grow up playing in a building a girl your age actually designed for them. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you just gave this block?" I told her I did. I don't think I fully did, not until that exact moment, standing on a vacant lot that was about to stop being vacant, surrounded by people who'd waited 6 years for exactly this. I think about my grandmother almost every day. I think about the lobby she showed me when I was 8 years old, about deciding, on purpose, how light falls on people who will never know your name. I think about the letter, about the trust she built quietly for 26 years without ever once needing credit for it in real time. I think about the unfinished drawing, the one that somehow found its way into my own hands before I even knew it existed. Proof that some ideas really do travel further than we can explain. Mostly, though, I think about the version of myself who stood in that living room on May 13th and watched 2 years of work turn to ash and smoke in a fireplace, and said nothing except a quiet, "Okay," before walking upstairs. I think about how close I came that night to believing what my parents believed about me, that I was the practical one, the sensible backup, the daughter who'd figure something out close to home while her brother got called the future. I didn't believe it in the end, not because I was braver than anyone else in a similar situation, and not because I had some special reserve of confidence other overlooked daughters don't have. I believed something different because one woman, over the course of years, quietly, patiently, without ever making it a performance, showed me a different possible sentence to live inside. Not "practical girls stay close to home." Something closer to build something extraordinary and sign your own name to it, and don't wait for the room to notice before you decide it's real. I didn't need my parents' approval to become the person I already was underneath their assumptions about me. I needed one person who saw it early enough, clearly enough, and loved me enough to build a door that would still be standing whenever I was finally ready to walk through it myself. She left me her name, the middle name I share with her, the one nobody in my family had thought twice about until this year. She left me her letter, her trust, her unfinished drawing, her whole quiet, extraordinary way of paying attention to someone nobody else thought to watch closely. She left me proof, in her own precise architectural handwriting, that I had never actually been invisible. My family simply hadn't been looking, and I was done waiting for them to. There's one more piece of this story I didn't learn until almost a year later, and I think it belongs here, near the end, because it changed how I understood everything that came before it. I was home for winter break during my freshman year at Cornell, going through a box of my grandmother's old photographs with my great-uncle Frank, the same quiet relative who'd said at Thanksgiving, "Vivian always said this girl had her hands." He was in his 80s by then, sharper than most people gave him credit for, and he'd brought over a shoebox of photographs from the 1960s he thought I might want to see. Somewhere in the middle of that box was a photograph of 2 teenage girls standing in front of a half-built house. One of them, unmistakably my grandmother at maybe 16, grinning, hard hat tilted back on her head. The other girl I didn't recognize. "That's Constance," Uncle Frank said. "Your grandmother's older sister. You never met her. She passed a long time before you were born." I didn't know Grandma had a sister. He was quiet for a moment, turning the photograph over in his hands. "Constance was supposed to be the architect, originally. Smarter than Vivian by most people's accounts. Better with numbers, better with clients. But she was the oldest, and back then that meant she was the one who was supposed to stay close, help run the household, look after the younger kids while their father worked. Vivian was the second daughter, the one everyone assumed would just get married and disappear into some other family's life. Nobody took her seriously at first. Constance was the one their father actually paid for a semester of drafting school. Vivian had to talk her way into her own education, one skeptical professor at a time, entirely on her own. I sat with that for a long time. My grandmother, the woman who spent her entire career being underestimated by clients and inspectors and colleagues, the woman who wrote me a letter about being disbelieved by her own family, had once been the overlooked sister herself, standing in the shadow of an older sibling everyone assumed was destined for something bigger. "What happened to Constance?" I asked. "She got married at 20, had 4 kids, never touched architecture again after that first semester. I don't think she resented it exactly. Different time, different expectations, and by all accounts, she loved her family. But I remember your grandmother saying, more than once, later in life, that she never fully stopped thinking about the two of them switching places right at the start, and how differently things might have gone if somebody had simply asked Constance, even once, what she actually wanted, instead of deciding it for her before she ever had the chance to answer." I understood, sitting there with that photograph, why my grandmother had been so deliberate about the letter, about the timing, about the trust she built entirely outside anyone else's control. She wasn't just protecting me from my parents' particular blind spot. She was correcting something that had happened a full generation earlier to her own sister that nobody had ever gone back to fix. She built the door for me that nobody had ever built for Constance, or, in her own quieter way, for herself in those early years before she fought her way into that drafting school, one stubborn conversation at a time. I think that's the part of this whole story that still gets me the most, even now. It wasn't really about me at all, not entirely. It was about a 91-year pattern finally getting interrupted, one careful, patient, 26-year plan at a time, by a woman who understood, better than almost anyone I've ever known, that sometimes the only way to fix something broken in a family is to build around it, quietly, for decades, and wait for exactly the right moment to open the door. It's November again as I write this. Almost exactly 1 year since that Thanksgiving, since the phone rang in my parents' kitchen and my mother said, "You mean my daughter?" in a voice I'd never heard her use before. Harbor Point Community Pavilion opens to the public next month. I'm flying home for the ribbon cutting, along with my entire studio cohort from Cornell, because my professor asked to bring the class to see a fellow student's actual built work, which is not a sentence I ever expected to be true about myself at 19. My parents are hosting Thanksgiving again this year. Same house, same extended leaves in the dining table. My mother called me last week to ask, genuinely, carefully, what I wanted on the table this year, whether there was anything specific I'd like to see included, which is a question she had never once asked me in 18 years before this one. Beckett's coming home from his broadcasting program with his girlfriend, someone he met doing color commentary for a women's basketball game last spring, and he told me on the phone that he's planning to actually toast me this year, publicly, the way Dad used to toast me for stuff I barely deserved, which made both of us laugh so hard I had to put the phone down for a second. My father sent me an email 2 days ago, an actual email, formatted like something he'd clearly drafted and redrafted, with 3 specific questions about my current studio project, a mixed-use development I'm working on for my sophomore design seminar. Real questions, detailed ones, the kind that only come from someone who'd actually sat with the drawings I'd sent him, alone, before writing back. I don't know exactly what this Thanksgiving is going to look like yet. I know it won't be like the one from a year ago. Nothing that dramatic, nothing that seismic. I think, honestly, that's the whole point. The extraordinary version of this story already happened. What comes after extraordinary, if you're lucky, if people actually do the work, is something quieter and steadier and much harder to notice from the outside. An ordinary dinner where everyone at the table finally, actually, sees each other. That's the part nobody puts in the highlight reel. That's the part I'm most looking forward to. I want to tell you about one more night, because I think it's important, and because most stories like this skip past it in favor of the triumphant parts. It happened in late September, my first semester at Cornell, weeks before the Whitfield Prize ceremony, months before groundbreaking, long after the fire, but long before I'd fully proven anything to anyone, including myself. I was 3 weeks into my first serious studio critique, working on a mid-rise housing project, and my professor, a visiting critic named Adrian Voss, notoriously blunt, notoriously unimpressed by credentials, tore my concept apart in front of the entire studio. Not cruelly, exactly, but thoroughly, methodically, in a way that left almost nothing standing. He said my circulation was naive. He said my structural logic didn't hold past the 3rd floor. He said, in front of 18 of my classmates, that I was clearly talented, but currently coasting on instinct instead of rigor, which stung precisely because some part of me suspected it was true. I went back to my dorm room that night and sat on my bed for a long time without turning on the lights. And for the first time since the fire, since NASA, no, since the fellowship, since Desmond, since all of it, I let myself think the thought I'd been keeping carefully locked away for over a year. What if they were right about me? What if I really am just the practical one, dressed up this year in a $50,000 prize and a nice acceptance letter, about to be quietly, embarrassingly exposed as exactly what my father always assumed I was? I called Grandpa Walter, mostly because I didn't know who else to call at 11 at night on a Tuesday. And I told him what had happened, and I told him the thought I'd been having, the ugly one, the one that sounded suspiciously like my father's voice from 2 years earlier. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about almost every week since. Your grandmother got torn apart in critiques for 40 years, Josie. She used to come home from client meetings so frustrated she'd throw her pencil across the studio. Actually throw it. Dent the wall once, we had to patch it. She wasn't gifted in some effortless way that meant she never struggled. She was gifted in the much harder way. The way where you get knocked down constantly and you get back up anyway, over and over for decades, because the work matters more to you than the bruise does. That's not proof you're an imposter. That's what it actually looks like to be doing something real. I didn't magically feel better the next morning. I want to be honest about that. I went back into studio still a little rattled, still half convinced Adrian Voss might be right about me. But I revised the project. I rebuilt the circulation from scratch. I met with a structural professor during office hours 3 separate times that week, asking questions I was embarrassed to ask, feeling foolish more than once. 3 weeks later, at the final review, Adrian Voss looked at my revised project for a long time without saying anything, which by that point in the semester, I'd learned was actually his highest form of praise, because he only stayed quiet like that when he genuinely didn't have a criticism ready. Finally, he said, "This is what I was hoping you'd figure out how to do. Don't let one bad Tuesday convince you otherwise next time." I think about that night more than almost any other single moment in this whole story. More than the fire, more than the phone call at Thanksgiving, because it's the one that taught me something the dramatic moments couldn't teach me on their own. That believing in yourself isn't a single decision you make once, in one triumphant scene, and then never have to make again. It's a decision you end up making over and over, quietly, on ordinary Tuesday nights nobody else will ever know about, long after the people who doubted you have gone home and stopped watching. I went back to visit Ashworth Cole over winter break, the same office where all of this had technically started, and Priya Deshmukh pulled me into her office at the end of the day, the way she used to on Fridays during the fellowship. "I have something I've been meaning to tell you," she said, "and I kept putting it off because I wasn't sure it was mine to tell. But I think you're old enough now, and I think Vivian would want you to know." She told me that she and my grandmother had actually had a falling out, years before I was born, over almost exactly the kind of thing this whole story turned out to be about. Priya had been a junior architect at the firm in the early 1990s, talented, ambitious, and my grandmother, by then a senior partner, had passed her over for a major promotion in favor of a less talented but more safely conventional male colleague. Worried, my grandmother admitted to her years later, that clients wouldn't take the firm seriously with two women running point on major projects at once. She apologized to me almost 15 years after it happened, Priya said. Out of nowhere, over lunch, completely unprompted. She said she'd spent her whole career fighting to be taken seriously, and then, the one time she had actual power to change things for someone else, she'd made the safe, cowardly choice instead of the right one, and she never forgave herself for it. She said watching me eventually succeed anyway, on my own, without her help, was simultaneously the proudest and most ashamed she'd ever felt about anyone in her professional life. I sat with that for a long moment. Is that why she trusted you with the scholarship fund? With me? I think so, Priya said. I think your grandmother spent the second half of her career quietly trying to build the doors she hadn't built the first time around, for people like me, and eventually, for you. I don't think she ever fully forgave herself for the mistake. I think she just decided the best apology available to her was to make absolutely sure it never happened again to anyone she had the power to help. I left that office that afternoon with a version of my grandmother that was more complicated, more human, and somehow more admirable than the version I'd been carrying around for a year. Not a woman who got everything right the first time. A woman who got something badly wrong once, felt the full weight of it, and spent decades quietly making sure the next generation of overlooked women wouldn't have to inherit her mistake along with everything else she left behind. I think that's the real inheritance, more than the trust fund, more than the letter, more than the unfinished drawing. She didn't leave me a perfect blueprint. She left me proof that you can get something badly wrong and still spend the rest of your life building it right, one deliberate door at a time, for someone who isn't even born yet. If I could go back and stand next to 17-year-old me in that kitchen on April 22nd, holding a manila envelope she didn't yet know was about to become the least important copy of her own future, I don't think I'd tell her not to be hurt. I think the hurt was correct. I think anyone standing in that kitchen, watching her father recite her brother's batting average instead of asking a single follow-up question about a 1510 SAT score, should feel exactly as hurt as I felt. What I'd tell her instead is this. The hurt doesn't have to be the whole story. It can be the beginning of one, if you're willing to do something quiet and unglamorous and completely unwitnessed for a very long time before anyone else notices. I'd tell her that the version of success that finally arrives at that Thanksgiving table isn't going to feel like a fairy tale. It's going to feel, mostly, like exhaustion. Like driving downtown in a borrowed car at 6:52 in the morning for 10 weeks straight. Like redrawing the same stairwell detail 11 times because someone kept handing it back with one word scrawled in red pen. Like sitting alone in a library after it closes because your own house is too loud with somebody else's dream to think clearly about yours. I'd tell her that not everyone in that kitchen is going to become a villain, and not everyone is going to become instantly wonderful either. Beckett is going to spend 2 more years quietly protecting a secret he doesn't fully understand yet. Not because he's brave, but because he's scared. The same way you're scared, just pointed in a different direction. Your mother is going to need 11 days after the truth comes out just to find the words, "I looked up your renderings last night." And that's going to matter more than you expect it to. Your father is going to need a cold porch in December, and one specific, well-prepared question about a trust system before either of you believes he's actually trying. And I'd tell her about the letter. Not the contents, I wouldn't spoil that. I don't think she'd want me to. Just that it exists. That someone was watching this whole time, closely enough to build a door in advance for a moment neither of them could have predicted the shape of yet. I'd tell her to trust that the quiet ones who ask real questions, who remember details, who show up without being asked, are worth more in the long run than every loud declaration of love that only ever gets spent on the child standing in the spotlight. Mostly, though, I'd tell her to keep applying. Keep submitting the applications online at 9:47 at night, even after the printed backups get burned. Keep driving downtown in a borrowed Buick, even when nobody asks where you're going. Keep believing a $50,000 prize and a Cornell acceptance letter and a $91,000 trust fund are possible outcomes for a girl her own family has already quietly decided is the practical one. Because none of that language belongs to her. It was only ever a story someone else told about her, in a kitchen, with a manila envelope, on an ordinary Tuesday in April. And stories other people tell about you are not obligated to become the story you actually live. If you've ever sat in a living room and watched your own effort get treated as smaller than someone else's potential, I want you to know something. The smallness was never true. It was only ever convenient. Convenient for the people who found it easier to invest in one obvious, loud, visible future than to look closely enough to notice a quieter one sitting right across the table from them the whole time. If you've ever been called practical, in a tone that meant smaller, safer, easier to overlook, I want you to hear it the way I've learned to hear it now, months later, on the other side of all of this. Practical isn't a ceiling. Sometimes it's just what extraordinary looks like before anyone else has bothered to look closely enough to see it clearly. You don't need your family to burn something in a fireplace for your story to matter. You don't need a phone to ring at Thanksgiving in front of 24 relatives. You don't need a dead grandmother's sealed letter to prove you were worth investing in all along. Those are just the specific shapes my story happened to take. Yours might look completely different. A quieter application nobody watches you submit. A job nobody thinks to ask real questions about. A version of yourself you're building in the margins of a life someone else has already decided the plot of. Build it anyway. Sign your own name to it. Let the thing you make speak first, and yourself second, the way my grandmother taught me to, long before either of us understood exactly why that lesson was going to matter as much as it eventually did. If this hit somewhere true for you tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me what you're building right now that the people closest to you haven't noticed yet. Tell me what they couldn't burn, even if they never lit the match on purpose, even if all they ever did was simply forget to look. Because you are not invisible. You never were. They just weren't looking closely enough yet. I see you. And somewhere, quietly, so does whoever left the door open for you before you even knew you'd need it. The official Cormac Whitfield Prize ceremony took place in late January in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., alongside the 10 other finalists from across the country, each of us presenting our projects one final time to a room full of practicing architects, journalists, and past prize winners going back almost 20 years. I almost didn't invite my parents. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's an important detail in a story that could otherwise sound too neatly resolved by that point. It was only January, barely 6 weeks removed from Thanksgiving, barely 3 weeks removed from that porch conversation with my father. I wasn't sure yet whether inviting them meant genuine trust or just old habit. The same instinct that had spent 18 years quietly making room for people who hadn't yet earned it. I called Grandpa Walter and asked him what he thought. "I think," he said slowly, "that your grandmother would tell you the same thing she used to tell junior architects nervous about presenting to a difficult client. You don't withhold the invitation because you're protecting yourself from disappointment. You extend it, clearly, on your own terms, and then you let them decide, in real time, in front of witnesses, whether they're actually capable of showing up the way they say they want to. That tells you more than 6 weeks of cautious phone calls ever could." So I invited them. All of them. My parents, Beckett, Grandpa Walter, even Aunt Denise and Uncle Rich, who'd been so genuinely delighted at Thanksgiving that I wanted them there too. Everyone came. My father took 2 vacation days from his insurance office, the first vacation days he'd used all year that weren't spent driving Beckett to a tournament. I presented Harbor Point one final time, this version polished by months of real construction documents, real client meetings, real structural consultations Desmond had walked me through personally. I talked about the covered market space, the storm shelter function, the diagonal light bands across the lobby floor that I still, to this day, don't fully know whether I invented myself or half remembered from a drawing I'd never actually seen. When I finished, the room applauded, and Carol Whitfield Reyes came up to formally announce the winner, even though by then I already knew. Even though the $50,000 was already technically mine as of that phone call at Thanksgiving. There was still something enormous about hearing her say my full name out loud into a microphone in front of a ballroom of strangers who took architecture as seriously as my grandmother always had. "Josephine Renee Hartwell." I looked out into the crowd as I walked up. My father was standing, clapping so hard I genuinely worried for a second that he might actually injure himself. My mother had both hands pressed over her mouth again, the same gesture from Thanksgiving, except this time there was nothing complicated underneath it. Nothing but plain, uncomplicated pride. Beckett had his phone up, recording the whole thing, grinning so widely I could see it from the stage. Grandpa Walter wasn't clapping at all. He was just sitting very still, looking at the empty seat beside him that he'd specifically requested when he made the reservation, the one nobody else was allowed to sit in. The one he told me afterward he'd reserved on purpose, quietly, for exactly the person you'd expect. Afterward, in the hotel lobby, my father pulled me aside. "I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it, not just accept it politely because you're being gracious." He took a breath. "I spent years being proud of your brother out loud, constantly, to anyone who'd listen, and I told myself that was just what being a supportive parent looked like. I never once thought about what it looked like from where you were standing, watching all of it happen, night after night, without anyone doing the same for you. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for that. I'm going to spend it doing this instead, showing up, asking real questions, clapping loud enough to hurt my hands in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C. in January for exactly as long as it takes for you to actually believe I mean it every time. "You're getting there," I told him. "I know," he said. "I'm not finished, but I'm getting there." I want to end with one final detail. One I didn't fully understand until my second semester at Cornell, going through the rest of the box Grandpa Walter had given me back in February. Underneath the unfinished drawing, underneath the sketchbooks and the technical pens, there was a single index card, easy to miss, easy to overlook entirely if you weren't looking closely. The same mistake, I suppose, that had cost me so much for so long before this whole story started. On it, in my grandmother's tight architectural handwriting, was a single sentence, undated, unexplained. The kind of note she must have written to herself at some point over the decades and simply never thrown away. "The ones who see you clearly are rarely the loudest ones in the room. Build for them. Let the rest catch up eventually. Or don't. Either way, keep building." I don't know exactly when she wrote it, or what specific moment prompted it, whether it was about Constance, or about Priya, or about some client meeting decades before I was born, or about me, somehow, in advance, the way so much of what she left behind seemed to arrive exactly on time, despite having been prepared years earlier. I've stopped trying to pin it down to one single meaning. I think, honestly, that's exactly how she would have wanted it. A sentence built to hold more than one true thing at once, the way the best buildings do, the way she taught me, without ever fully explaining it out loud, that the best doors are the ones built quietly, patiently, on purpose, long before the person who needs them even knows to come looking. I keep that index card taped to the inside cover of my current sketchbook. I look at it before every studio review, every client meeting, every ordinary Tuesday when the work feels harder than it should. It reminds me of the whole shape of the story every single time. The fire, the fellowship, the letter, the phone call, the porch in December, the ballroom in January, the groundbreaking in June, all of it. Every quiet brick of it, built by a girl the room had already decided wasn't worth watching closely. They just weren't looking. I built anyway. And eventually, one Thanksgiving phone call at a time, the whole room finally learned how. I started this story by telling you about a phone call in a kitchen. 24 people frozen mid-bite. My mother's voice cracking on the words, "You mean my daughter." I want to close it by telling you about the Thanksgiving that came after, the one I mentioned earlier, the one I flew home for, exactly 1 year later, almost to the day. The table looked the same leaves extended, same ironed tablecloth, same rotating cast of aunts and cousins and neighbors folded into the count until it came out to 26 this time, 2 more than the year before. Beckett wore a plain sweater instead of a jersey, sat next to his girlfriend, laughed easily in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. My father stood at the head of the table with the carving knife, and when he raised his glass for the traditional toast, he didn't say a single word about scholarships or scouts or big years ahead. "This year," he said, looking deliberately, slowly around the entire table instead of fixing his eyes on just one child the way he used to, "I want to toast every single person at this table who built something this year that the rest of us didn't take the time to notice until it was already finished. I've learned a few things about that particular mistake over the last 12 months, and I don't intend to keep making it." He looked at me. He looked at Beckett. He looked for a long moment at my mother, who reached over and took his hand under the table like it was the most natural gesture in the world, though I know, now, exactly how much unglamorous, unwitnessed work had gone into making it feel that natural again. Nobody's phone rang that night. There was no dramatic reveal, no envelope, no ash floating up a chimney flue. It was, by every reasonable measure, an ordinary family dinner, a little loud, a little chaotic, baby Rosa smashing green beans into her high chair tray again, 1 year older, considerably more committed to the bit. I think that's actually the ending I'd choose, if I got to choose, over the dramatic one. Not because the dramatic one didn't matter. It mattered enormously. It's the reason any of this ordinary dinner was possible at all. But because I've learned over the past year that extraordinary moments are rare and loud and easy to remember, while ordinary moments, the quiet accumulation of 100 small repairs, are what actually hold a family together once the cameras, so to speak, have gone home. My grandmother spent 49 years designing buildings around exactly that principle. That the extraordinary parts of a structure matter less, in the end, than whether the ordinary spaces inside it, the hallways, the lobbies, the quiet corners nobody photographs for the magazine spread, actually work for the people who have to live inside them every single day. I think she was training me for more than architecture all those years ago in that lobby downtown, telling me to look up and notice how the light moved. I think she was training me to notice, eventually, when a family finally, quietly, unglamorously, started to work the way it should have all along. I raised my glass with everyone else that night. I didn't need to say anything dramatic. Nobody at that table needed convincing anymore of anything I'd built. They'd already seen it. The pavilion 4 blocks from our old house, filled every single day now with exactly the kind of neighborhood life I'd designed it to hold. The acceptance letter framed on Grandpa Walter's wall next to Grandma's old drafting tools. The index card taped inside my sketchbook that I still read before every review. They were finally, simply, looking. That's all I'd ever actually wanted, from the very beginning. Long before I understood what an envelope full of applications could survive. Long before a letter sealed in my grandmother's handwriting taught me that being overlooked by the people closest to you is a wound, but it is never, ever the whole story. Not if you're willing to keep building quietly enough, patiently enough, for long enough, that eventually, one Thanksgiving at a time, the room finally catches up to what was true about you all along. If you've ever been the practical one, the quiet one, the one everyone assumed would simply figure it out on her own while somebody else got the toast, the highlight reel, the whole family's undivided attention, I hope you already know this, but I'll say it plainly anyway, one more time, before I let you go. You were never actually invisible. You were only ever unnoticed, which is a much smaller, much more fixable problem than anyone made it feel like at the time. Keep building. Sign your name to it. The room will catch up. And if it doesn't, build somewhere the room can finally see you clearly. There is always, in the end, more than one room in this world, and at least one of them has been waiting for exactly what you're making. People sometimes ask me, now, whether I hate my parents for what happened in that kitchen, for the years leading up to it, for the manila envelope and the fireplace, and every dinner table where my brother's batting average outweighed my SAT score without anyone at that table blinking. I don't. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than the anger would have. I don't hate them because hating them would mean handing them one more year of my attention they hadn't earned. And I'd already spent 18 years doing exactly that, quietly, without complaint, waiting for a version of love that measured itself in real questions instead of loud toasts. I'd rather spend my attention now on the pavilion filling up with neighborhood kids every afternoon, on a sketchbook with an index card taped inside the cover, on a dorm room in Ithaca with an unfinished drawing hanging over my desk, on a father who learned, eventually, painfully, how to ask about a trust system on a cold porch in December. Forgiveness, it turns out, was never really about deciding they deserved it. It was about deciding I'd rather build than burn, even toward the people who once, carelessly, burned something of mine first. My grandmother knew that lesson 40 years before I did. She just had the patience and the foresight and the quiet architectural precision to make sure I'd learn it exactly when I needed it most. Not a day too early, not a day too late. Timed as carefully as everything else she ever built. That, in the end, is the whole design. Not the fire, not even the phone call. Just a door, built quietly, on purpose, years in advance, by someone who was always watching closely enough to see exactly who I already was.